Hello, everyone, and welcome. Bonjour et bienvenue. My name is Judith Abitan, and I am the Executive Director of the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights. Before we begin, please note that to access the simultaneous interpretation feature in English or French, please click on the interpretation icon that looks like a globe near the bottom right of your screen, and then indicate your preferred language as English or French. Please note as well that you will be able to submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function near the bottom of the screen. Please identify yourself and your organization when you submit your question. The Raoul Wallenberg Centre is situated on the traditional territory of the Kehaka, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. We recognize and respect the Kehaka as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we meet today. The Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights, in partnership with Binghamton University's Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, are delighted to host this important webinar on the humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia's Tigray region. I'm also delighted to introduce my co-moderator, Garnett, an outspoken parliamentarian in the Canadian House of Commons, a tireless advocate for human rights and religious freedom, and a member of the Raoul Wallenberg All-Party Parliamentary Caucus for Human Rights. Since the fighting broke out on November 4th, 2020, thousands of civilians have been killed, hundreds of thousands of people have been internally displaced within Tigray, and some 63,000 refugees have fled to Sudan. There have been reports of widespread rape and other gender-based violence targeting women and girls across Tigray. A recent statement by UN agencies and NGOs working in the region said they were, and I quote, alarmed by reports of increasing violence against women and girls, including harrowing accounts of sexual violence, and that the response remains wholly inadequate to the scale of need. Meanwhile, humanitarian agencies have reported attacks and looting of hospitals and other medical facilities across Tigray. In late March, workers for the humanitarian agency Médecins Sans Frontières had one of their missions to the regional capital Mekelle brutally interrupted twice. There have been repeated calls on all parties to the conflict in Tigray to allow unfettered humanitarian access. As of April 27th, the UN cited improvements, but said that the situation in Tigray remains volatile and is hampering partners' efforts to deliver timely humanitarian assistance. The mass displacement of people from agrarian areas of Tigray, as well as allegations that crops have been deliberately destroyed and grain stores looted, have prompted the UN and other commentators to warn of catastrophic food insecurity and even the risk of impending famine. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights have agreed to conduct a joint investigation into the human rights violations and abuses committed by all parties in the context of the Tigray conflict, as part of the much-needed accountability process for the victims. The EHRC and OHCHR have been monitoring closely the human rights situation since the start of the conflict in November. Both organizations remain deeply concerned about the reports of serious human rights violations and abuses and the devastating impact of the conflict on the civilian population. With multiple actors involved in the conflict and the gravity of the reported violations, their objective and independent investigation is most crucial and urgently needed. The agreement to collaborate in a joint investigation is the result of an ongoing partnership and engagement between the two organizations, founded on shared objectives to advance and strengthen respect and protection of human rights, as well as accountability for violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Such investigations are within the existing mandate of both organizations. The deployment will start for an initial period of 3 months and has already obtained the support from the United Nations, the African Union, the European Union, the United States, and the UN Security Council. We will begin our discussions with a first-hand account of the atrocities on the ground from Dr. Hayalom, who worked as the executive director of the Ader Hospital of Mekelle University, which is the largest hospital in Tigray. This testimony will be followed by an assessment of the crisis by the following distinguished panelists. Alex de Waal, executive director of the World Peace Foundation, research professor at the Fletcher School of Global Affairs, Tufts University, and Professorial Fellow at the London School of Economics. Michelle Gavin, Senior Fellow for Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Jeff Sizemore, Senior Advisor on Atrocity Prevention in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the US State Department, leading and coordinating the Bureau's genocide and atrocity prevention work, and Emily Rose, Policy Officer in the State Department's Bureau of Democracy and Human Rights and Labor, where she currently focuses on the Horn of Africa. We can now move to the live testimony.
This is Hayalom from Eider Comprehensive Specialized Hospital, Mekelle University. Around 10 million population is served in this hospital. So this is the largest hospital in Tigray, also one of the largest hospital also in Ethiopia. I will just mentioning some of that we encounter during the war, which is still in progress. So let me begin from, because Mekelle has been seized or under the control of the federal government and also the Amhara militia and the Eritreans on the late November. So Mekelle is under the control in November 28th. So in early December, a total blackout was happened. There is no communication and electricity, and our patients inside the hospital are starting to die because we couldn't provide them oxygen and medicine. And especially the chronic disease patients like diabetes, HIV, and the kidney patients, they start to die because there is no any means of medicine, because the medicine has been taken overnight after they enter to Mekelle. So our medicine stores has been vandalized, and also the ambulance have been taken. So all these have been taken, and the hospital was completely collapsing. So what we did was I approached one of the commander in the hospital who's stationed as a military, and asked him, the hospital is collapsing, if they need the hospital to function. So we need at least a fuel, because there is no light from which be given from central government. So we need a fuel to run a generator. And then he said, how can we give you, because you are a sympathizer of the outside regime, which is the TPLF, which is the regional leaders, which has been fighting along with the federal government. And then I just again moved to the general who led the war also, and with my colleagues. And we moved to that general, and we asked him that we are in a problem. The hospital is collapsing, and we need oxygen and medicines. And then he just also laughed, and he intimidated because you guys have been collaborating with the outside region, and then we are not sure that we'll give you because you are the one. So he tried to just intimidate, and also some sort of and then we fear that they may also kill us. But in any way, finally we make some sort of points, because we told him that if the military is also get injured, so this hospital has to function so that they can give at least some first aid and some medications and some treatments. So based on that, he understand, and then he gave us a fuel, but the medicine is not there. And we told him that we need a medicine because all the drugs have been taken. And he said they took it because they need it, he said. So and then based on that, we got some sort of fuel, and then we start to run a little bit. We got a fuel, and then a little bit few oxygens are produced. But in the meantime, the military came with some 2 girls, and they just gave them to the ward. And then after they get treatment, the girls have disappeared. That was a point of and then the military started to fire on the hospital. They said, where are the girls? And we don't know, because they have been here, and they asked for me. I couldn't find them. But later, because they left, after this military left, I asked the nurses what has happened, and they told me that it is because they are just gang raped by this military. So that was how this raping is starting in early December. So Upon that, we quite a lot of girls and women are coming to Aida, and we just reported to the government raping is become rampant, and many girls and women are coming to hospital. Most of them are either pregnant or HIV positive or hepatitis positive. And for instance, in one case, the woman she used to take ART. She was in ART and antiretroviral drug, which is used for HIV patients. So when they start to rape her, and she said for them that she is HIV positive, and they said, "Oh, it's fine. We'll have that virus and to distribute or to disseminate all women and girls in Tigray so that they all can be killed or die." So on purpose of that, they just rape her, gang rape her with 5 soldiers. And then you can imagine 5 of them are now become positive. And then 5 of them and go into the rural area of Tigray, and then they can also make again dissemination or distribution or transmission of this HIV or virus. So this is the purpose that they did. What it is intended to be a genocidal, because of by intentionally they just transmitted HIV across our girls and women in Tigray. So this is one typical example. So after we reported these raping cases, now the government is in denial. On that time, it was in denial stage because they said it is those who claim that they are in TPLF or the outside regime supporters who claimed that they're raping. So along this way, we got quite a lot of intimidation and arrest in our hospitals for one day, mostly. And even the military came to say to Aida, where there is a place called One Stop Center. This One Stop Center is used to give a treatment and rehabilitation for those rape victims. And then after they get treated and rehabilitation here, we will send them to the downtown. There is what area called safe house, where they can stay a bit longer until they finish their medication and treatment. Then in doing so, the military came and harassed the nurses and also our leaders of the hospital, because you are the one who cooked that. And we told him that, and we brought them, look, these are how these girls are getting raped and victimized. So, but they don't believe us. They don't believe us. They said, no, we don't believe you. And then when this will happen, and this will happen again, on February, it reaches to either around 215, and in the whole Tigray reaches around 500. This is in just in February. So it becomes very rampant, and then what happened is the president of the country, President Ms. Sahle-Work Zewde, came to verify whether there is a gang rape or not. So she came to Aida, to the hospital, and I took her on the February 19. I took her to the one-stop center where the girls and women get treatment, and I took her to the downtown where there is quite a lot of them in the safe house to get some sort of rehabilitation and any support. So after we took her, I think she realized that. And then also she wanted to discuss, or she wanted to meet at least 2 or 3 of victims. One was, she was in the mid, I think she is 20 years old, and she's a married lactating woman. And the military took her from the street of Mekelle to 8 miles away from the city, which is called the Garab Guba. And then, as I told you, she is a lactating mother. She has 2 months baby. So there are 6 militaries, 4 Eritrean and 2 Ethiopian military. They took her And on December, I think in Ethiopian it's December 19, but in will be in December 25, around that. And then they took her and in Garabguba, 8 miles away, and they gang raped her for 2 weeks. Then after they realized that she's getting weak and tired and she's getting sick, and the baby is also getting sick, her baby is also getting sick. And then they realized that she may die at their hands. So they decided to take her back to her home. And they asked her where her home is. So they fear also that if they took her back to home, people may realize that she has been with them. So what they did was they just came to her compound, her home, and they found her husband. And they told him that your wife is with us. So if you want to take her back, you have to pay 5,000 Ethiopian birr. So he paid 5,000 Ethiopian birr, and then he brought his wife, and then he brought to Ida. That's why we found. And the other girl, she talked is again from Adigrat, nearby village of Adigrat, a city which is 120 kilometers away from Mekelle. And she's also raped by 15 Eritrean troops. So Eritrean troops raped her 15. So in 50, so they gang raped her, and finally after they raped her, she was devastated, and she has sustained some injuries in the pelvic organ, and she cannot move around. So then they just dump her on the street, near to the street. So people find her, and they ask the military, and they took an ambulance and they brought her to Ida. So now she is in a wheelchair. She cannot move anymore. So she is getting better, but still she is moving in a wheelchair. So these two are examples that the president by herself heard from the victims by themselves. And then after the president back to Addis Ababa, flown back to Addis Ababa, she released a press release that there is real atrocities of rape in Tigray. Another example that we found disturbing is in the mid-February. In the mid-February, we got a call from nearby a little bit called Nagash, where there is a prestigious mosque, and somebody called us and he needed an ambulance because we cannot send an ambulance. What was the Eritrean troop raped her, and then after they raped her, they inserted hot metal to her genitalia. She was completely burned, and then she wanted to see, but there is no hospital nearby, so they called us to send an ambulance that we couldn't because from away from Wokro, it was not possible on that time. So after next 3-4 days, we called by that number, but we couldn't find back. So probably she maybe died. So these are very typical part of rape. So when you come to numbers at the moment, in Ida only, there are more than 500 rape cases reported. In the whole Tigray, more than 1,100 was reported. So this is quite disturbing numbers. So in every rape cases, there are underreported. So it could be 10,000 and more raping is happening. More than 10,000 maybe happen. So now what we can say is, so the raping is used as a means for subdue of the society. So this is as a means of war, to subdue and to demoralize the society of Tigray. So this is really quite alarming, and the international community has to act, and the perpetrators have to also get justice, and justice has to be served so that these girls and women will be placed. Otherwise, the perpetrators will remain unaccountable, and our girls and women also continue to be raped by this military personnel. So I witnessed that this raping is used as a means to subdue the Tigrayan society. So these are so far that we find rapings, what's happening in Tigray in short. but there are actually quite a lot of disturbing reports from the raping that we find in her when we recorded their profiles. Many of them will tell you quite a lot of them. So in short, this is what I have, and I have of these data that I caught from our one-stop centers and also from the safe house. So many of the victims are still in safe house, but after one day, the military has identified the area and they go at night. So most of them are fear, and then they just move to their relatives and to the other places. But still, the safe house we have in downtown, and we are thinking to move all the place to another places because the military is identified, and the victims are feared that the military may come and then they may have a reprisal because they disclosed what was happened to them and what was happened to the community. So this is what I have. Thank you very much. And you can also reach me if we need more. Thank you very much.
Bonjour et merci à tous d'être ici pour cette importante discussion sur la situation au Tigray. It's a real honor for me to be able to co-moderate this panel. Since I started following this issue, I've tabled 25 petitions in the House of Commons calling for engagement and action by the Canadian government. But as members of Parliament, while we can sometimes be the pointy end of the spear of advocacy, we rely on all of the rest of you to do the heavy lifting and the hard work. Advocates, experts, public servants, civil society organizations. We rely on you to furnish us with the information and the support, as well as to mobilize public awareness in order to make our parliamentary engagement effective. So with that in mind, I want to start by really thanking the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights for all of their incredible work on so many different fronts, to thank the courageous firsthand witness who we just heard from with that, I think, really heart-wrenching testimony, and thank all of the experts who are joining us today for this panel who have already been introduced. I'm going to start off with a few kind of priming discussion questions, and welcome the panelists to share their response to these questions, as well as to interact with each other and respond to what others are saying. And after that, we'll move into questions and responses from the audience. So folks, while we ask these initial questions for me, please post your questions in the Q&A. You can start doing that right away, and we will be putting those together and asking those questions after these initial ones have started. The first question I wanted to ask is, many people who've listening may not have heard of the Tigray region prior to the last few months when it's been in the news. So I wonder if we can get a little bit of background in terms of how we got here, how we got to where we are right now, and then where we are in the present in relation to the past. So I'll open that up to whichever the panelist wants to start and go from there.
Well, why don't I take a stab at just setting the scene perhaps a bit. First off, thank you so much for inviting me to join you, and my thanks to the witness who provided that searing testimony. Really, nothing is more powerful than that. So essentially, the TPLF, which is the dominant political party in Tigray, the dominant authority in Tigray, for a long time, Ethiopia was governed by a coalition called the EPRDF, right? It was made up of different constituent entities. The TPLF was one of those constituent entities, and in fact, was the most powerful, was first among equals, for sure, in the context of political power, economic power, and military power in Ethiopia. And so over the course of a couple of decades, the TPLF was really the dominant political force, although it represents a small minority of the country. And there, over time, was a fair bit of resentment about the TPLF, a sense that a minority had outsized power And, the Ethiopian state did have a record sometimes of repressing its people. There were problematic human rights abuses, sort of throughout this period, so that it was, there are no perfect entities anywhere. This much is clear. Then there was a change in Ethiopian politics and in the Ethiopian government. A new leader ascended to the prime ministership, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who represented a different faction. He's of mixed parentage, but was representing the Oromo people. And as he consolidated power and kind of created a new political agenda in Ethiopia, pretty systematically, the TPLF lost power, lost access to those levers of political, military, and economic influence. Part of what's going on here from a political point of view is an argument about the nature of the Ethiopian state. So should Ethiopia be governed by sort of an ethnic federalism where these different ethnic identities that are an important part of people's sense of self in an Ethiopian context have significant political weight and sort of provide an organizational principle for the state? Or is that problematic? This is a long-standing debate in Ethiopia, and Prime Minister Abiy seemed to want to move away from this emphasis on ethnic federalism. Essentially, as he consolidated power, as his reform agenda, which initially seemed quite promising with an opening of political space in Ethiopia, started to take a bit of a turn toward a slightly more repressive, more problematic set of governing principles, you had more and more resistance from different parts of Ethiopia that were invested in the ethnic federalist system, and increasing tensions between particularly the TPLF and the center in Addis. And these tensions then came to a head, and we can talk about why. There were national elections that were postponed countrywide, ostensibly due to COVID-19, but elections went forward in Tigray. The TPLF insisted. This was seen as a completely unacceptable sort of defiance of federal authority. So but that was not the only issue. There were many, many points of tension between the two. And while it does seem to be the case that a preemptive TPLF strike on Ethiopian federal forces was the catalyst for the conflict, it's also true that both sides had been moving forces into position. You had movement on the Eritrean side of the border as well. The conflict was coming probably regardless of that attack, but hopefully that provides some degree of context. There's a long political history here, right, of tension and resentment of the TPLF for having long held power, and a broader argument in Ethiopia that implicates not just Tigray and Addis, but really the whole country about the fundamental nature of the state.
Could I just come in with an additional point here?
Yes.
Which is that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed won the Nobel Peace Prize primarily for the peace deal that he struck with the president of Eritrea, Isaias Afwerki, almost 3 years ago. It was normally under those circumstances, you would expect the Nobel Committee to share the prize between both sides. I mean, Nelson Mandela got it, but so did F.W. de Klerk, etc. They wisely chose not to share it with Isaias Afwerki. The assumption was that when peace was signed between these two neighbors who had been in it, they'd had a very fierce hot war 20 years ago and then gone into a cold war. The assumption was that Eritrea, which is really a totalitarian state and no constitution, no independent judiciary, no free press, etc., would begin to liberalize, would demobilize its enormous army, would begin to set journalists out of prison, etc. But not a bit of it. In fact, it used the opportunity of coming out of UN sanctions to rearm and remobilize. And in the current conflict, in fact, Eritrea is the senior partner. I think if Eritrea had not been involved, what we would be seeing today is a rocky sort of transition. A transition from an authoritarian to a more liberal order, with all the ups and downs that entails. Perhaps some conflict, some disturbances, but with the entry of Eritrea, with a president who has a record of always going for the most ruthless option, the most extreme option of repression, the dynamic in Tigray took a different turn. So it wasn't just a question of political management, etc., and perhaps mismanagement. The Eritrean factor introduced that component in that President Isaias has made two things very, very clear over the years. Number one is he doesn't think Ethiopia is a viable state, that it will follow the path of Yugoslavia or Congo to collapse, and indeed it should. And secondly, he sees his rival, his threat, being Tigray. And I think we see a policy that is frankly a policy of extermination against the people of Tigray, along with an agenda of emerging from the wreckage of Ethiopia as Eritrea as the dominant force in the region. And both these they're slightly parallel, they are related, and they're both profoundly disturbing.
Well, thank you very much. And I see we already have some questions coming in about the Eritrean role specifically. So I suspect that we'll have an opportunity to come back to that in a few minutes. I did want to ask a question about the crimes that have taken place and the question of the actions of other actors in pursuing justice for those crimes. We're all aware of the horrific human rights violations that have taken place, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, according to many organizations. We've heard more about that today. These crimes require a response from individual states who are party to conventions on the prevention of mass atrocities, as well as responses from international bodies. So what should international bodies be doing? And then what should individual states be doing, such as Canada, such as the United States, in response to these crimes to hold perpetrators accountable for them?
So I think with the United States, like one of the first step is to get people on the ground in Tigray to be able to start documenting. So we are glad to see that the joint OHCHR EHRC commission, the joint OHCHR EHRC commission will be arriving in the country soon to start documenting. But we see that as being like the very first step to being able to lay the groundwork for holding individuals accountable down the line, and perhaps doing larger accountability and justice mechanisms. I think it's going to be hard because there are so many different actors involved, and especially when it comes to accountability for the Eritrean defense forces who are committing potential human rights violations and abuses, especially because the Eritrean government obviously is not participating in that investigation. So that's something that's going to require a lot more work down the line and a lot more pressure from others.
I don't know if thank you for that. I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in on that question. I am always curious to hear, especially from our American guests, what they think the particular role Canada can play in these kinds of situations. We're situated differently. We have different capacities. What's a constructive role that Canada could be playing specifically in terms of addressing the need for justice and accountability here?
So in conversations that happen with partners and with like-minded individuals, which we do regularly. Ethiopia is obviously a topic that we're discussing right now. And I think Canada obviously is very much aligned with the United States when it looks at human rights abuses, atrocity prevention. We are both members of the International Atrocity Prevention Working Group, and this is something that we talk about regularly. And so, looking at areas where there might be demarches as far as accepting documentation efforts, looking at conflict-related sexual violence, ensuring the investigations findings are available, and that we are looking at the options available to ensure that it's justice kind of across the full spectrum, so that there's a justice strategy that includes like criminal accountability for those most responsible, for the human rights abuses and atrocities for all of the parties involved, and also establishing that reconciliation process and developing kind of a way forward so that there is an acceptable response for the people of Tigray, because one of the kind of great indicators of future violence is previous violence. And if the underlying issues on why the violence occurred now are not addressed, then you can effectively guarantee that it will resurface at some future point. And so we're looking to avoid recurrence and avoid retribution in the future.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on those questions? Which international bodies can or should be investigating this, or the role of particular states in responding?
Can I make a point about the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission? Because I think it's unfortunate that the UN entered into a partnership with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. I have no doubt about the personal credibility, integrity of individuals within the commission. However, they are under extreme pressure. That pressure has been intensified in the last few days because the government of Ethiopia has declared the TPLF a terrorist organization. And as we heard from Dr. Hayelon, the Ethiopian military is impeding the ability of medical staff, senior medical staff, in the region, providing essential assistance to survivors of rape. Will it be possible for an Ethiopian citizen working for a government organization to actually speak to victims, survivors, witnesses under this context, when it is quite possible, in fact, very likely, that the government is going to twist their arm, or worse, to say you are dealing with people who are members or sympathizers of a terrorist organization. And actually the situation is actually more serious than that. I was speaking to the editor of a newspaper in Addis Ababa, and he says that the fear that he and his staff have is not so much the security, but the mob. He says, yes, we would expect visits from the security. My journalists have been harassed and intimidated, but the worst thing that will happen from the security in Addis Ababa is that they will be detained and spend some time in detention. The mob, the vigilantes, could come and burn down your house and kill your family. And under these circumstances, it is, in my view, too much to expect the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to actually undertake an investigation of that type. And I think it was, I think the UN would be advised, particularly in the light of the designation of the TPLF as a terrorist organization, to say, we respect you, but we cannot proceed with this. We need an external investigation that also has a means of getting information from those areas that cannot be reached. There is an internet blackout and shut down. There is a mobile phone blackout. People cannot move freely. So obtaining information from those who are suffering, those who are witnesses, is going to be beyond the means of an organization such as the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission.
Thank you for that. I'd be curious to know if the other panelists agree with that, or if there are differences of view in terms of the capacity of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and whether we should be supporting that investigation or calling for a different framework of investigation.
I was just going to come in and say that I share a sense of confidence in the integrity of individuals who are a part of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, who have long records of courage and honesty and deep commitment to human rights, but recognize the realities that Alex is talking about, right? And I think the point I wanted to make is that as incredibly important as it is to get that access he's describing, to document what's happening, to bring clarity for the purposes of accountability, right? For the war crimes that we are seeing and the atrocities that we're seeing. Here's the thing that frustrates me a little bit about the discourse right now, which is that there's not a question about whether or not atrocities are being committed. We know this, that despite the difficulties of access, right, and the questions about independence, there is no doubt, there's no open question. And so there's an urgency right now about how you find your way out of this unbelievably devastating pattern of violence and forced starvation. And I think the international community, as important it is to focus on these investigations and accountability, accountability isn't going to happen right now, right? And there is an urgent crisis right now. So I do think that sometimes I just feel a little frustrated when the notion is that the international community's role is sort of to tee up something that's going to happen years down the line. That is important. It's not the only thing that's important. The other thing I just wanted to flag relative to the important points that Alex made is not only is it difficult to get information from many places, but I think one of the things that's making this so toxic and also enabling authorities who are responsible for what is happening within their own borders to deny reality is this stew of misinformation, propaganda, and disinformation that's become a part of the discourse around what's happening in Ethiopia. So there's so much out there, particularly on social media, that is twisted, and this is happening for multiple factions, right? In multiple facets, multiple sides of this conflict. So many untruths that it becomes easier, I think, to evade responsibility and accountability, because who can tell what's really true? And so what the international community needs to continue to come back to and focus on again and again is what we know to be the case. The very brave journalists, Ethiopian journalists and others who've gotten access to small pockets have told us what's happening. Where the UN has been able to go, they have told us what's happening. We know there's massive sexual violence. We know that there's a deliberate effort to deny people access to healthcare and access to food. We know these things. We know that Tigrayans are being arrested purely, it appears, on the basis of their identity. And so I think that sometimes the discourse gets a bit clouded, and it really is a matter of urgency for the international community to focus on how to stop the violence right now, in addition to these other questions.
If I could just respond to Michelle real quick.
Yes.
In crisis response situations, such as in Ethiopia, ceasing the violence is absolutely the most pressing concern. And there is no disagreement on that. There are other concerns, and obviously we're thinking things holistically and broadly, but there is no sort of debate as far as that the most pressing concern is the cessation of violence first, and then accountability, root cause, et cetera, to follow. And so I just wanted to make sure that we understand that there is absolutely agreement between us on that.
Excellent. I did I hear one other person wanting to come in on that? Yeah, go ahead, Emily.
Thank you. So I just, on OHCHR EHRC's joint investigation, I think, both Michelle and Alex raised very, very good points. I think it goes without saying that we really support that investigation. And there's no question that there's a lot of challenges that they are going to face and that they're already facing. But that said, we are, so I think there's, the way that we see it, the EHRC has access and contacts in Tigray, which is really important. And OHCHR is going to be able to bring some technical expertise and resources. And EHRC's engagement in the investigation is particularly important for being able to lay the groundwork for Ethiopian-led accountability and justice down the line. And additionally, I think like it's important to remember, like this is a starting point, right? Like we know, like as Michelle said, we know there's no question about what's happening, right? There's enough reporting going on, but what we need is more granular information, more specifics about not just perpetrators, but the scope of it. And I think it's also particularly important to have OHCHR engagement because that opens it up for bringing it into UN bodies' agendas, which currently has been a very big challenge, as I'm sure people have noticed. So I think that those are all really important reasons for the joint investigation, but I mean, I don't think anyone should be blind to the challenges, both in terms of access. But yeah, it's a starting point, and it's a good starting point, and we're glad that they will be able to be in country very soon.
Thank you very much. We've talked a bit about the humanitarian, the human rights dimension. Let's move on to exploring the humanitarian implications and how we can respond directly to those issues. What is your assessment of the dynamics in terms of starvation, displacement, and other humanitarian implications of this, and how can other actors treat the humanitarian consequences specifically and try to ameliorate the suffering of those who are affected?
May I respond to that? But before I do, I just want to make one small point about information, which is that for a woman in Tigray, a very conservative society, to come forward with the sorts of accounts that they have come forward with, takes extraordinary courage, and she will face enormous repercussions. A rape is not just a crime, and systematic rape of this type is not just a crime against humanity, it's also a starvation crime, because a woman will not be able to care for herself or her family, and the fear of rape means that women and girls cannot undertake absolutely essential activities, like farming, like traveling, like seeking out assistance. And so I think there's 2 points here. Number one, we need to actually just send a very, very simple and clear message to the women and girls of Tigray. We believe you. There are plenty of people out there on social media saying these stories are made up. There's a report from the Attorney General a couple of days ago on the massacre in Exum, the Ethiopian Attorney General, basically saying this is massively exaggerated, and we have there are a few cases of rape, and we know the perpetrators. And I think our first responsibility in responding to those women is to say, we believe you, and we affirm that this is not made up. Obviously, it is extraordinarily difficult to confirm those stories, but no woman or girl is going to make them up. And I think we just need to say that again and again. For just to affirm the dignity and the rights of these survivors. But let me pivot to the point about the humanitarian crisis. I've worked on the issue of famine and war-created famine since the mid-1980s for 37 years, in fact. And I worked in Ethiopia, in Darfur, in Rwanda, in Somalia, etc. I have never seen a case of such sustained, such systematic use of starvation as a method of war. Never anywhere. I was on the phone yesterday. I had a call from a colleague who's in the Tigray Defense Forces controlled areas. He was in a small village, and he's in his 60s, and he was sitting down with some men and women of his own age, and they were comparing what was happening now, their experience now, with their experience of the depths of that famine of 1984-85, a famine that killed 1 million people. And their view was, at the moment it is the same, but it is getting worse. The reason why the internationals have not called out famine is we have developed over the last decades very sophisticated information systems which measure nutrition, which measure mortality, which measure food consumption. And they're very strict protocols for gathering this information, for interpreting it, and for issuing according to a scale. It's a 5-point scale, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System, real mouthful. And level 5 is famine, level 4 is humanitarian emergency, down to level 2 and 1, which are normal. And there is a very complex, intricate process of which the government is part of to declare populations being in certain areas. The information that we have been able to get from Tigray is incredibly fragmentary because of this shutdown, because of the lack of access. And because of that, it has meant that we have not been able to ascertain with any accuracy or reliability what is going on. Nonetheless, 6 weeks ago, after long delays, nutritional surveys came out, 30% child malnutrition. That is famine level. I was speaking 2 days ago to those who had just been undertaking surveys in the same places. They say the level is now 50%. That is famine plus. We have 4.5 million people in what is called emergency. All those 4.5 million people have been plunged into emergency since November. The UN suspects the figure may be 5.2. And we have these consistent reports of troops going around, cutting down orchards, destroying, burning crops, preventing farmers from farming, going from village to village with the instruction, with the order, you will not plow, you will not harvest, you will not receive aid because we will punish you. We've heard this now from dozens of sources. When I first started hearing this 2 weeks ago, I thought one case, just a rumor, dozens of cases now. As I said, the only case I can think of, I've written a book on starvation, I have it here, History of Mass Starvation. The case that springs to mind is the Nazi hunger plan of 1941, possibly Pol Pot in the 1970s. And I think we just need to draw the conclusions. 4.5 million people we know are in emergency. Massive starvation crimes, that equals famine. Let's not beat around the bush. We have a famine on the scale of 1984-85. That killed 1 million people, and if we don't do anything about it, the population is not as big as that affected in 1984-85, it's about half. We're going to have 500,000 people, mainly children, starving to death in the next 9 to 12 months. And we are reaching, according to the estimates of the agencies in the field, we are reaching between 9 and 11% of that population. And we are being prevented from doing it by the Ethiopian and Eritrean authorities, and to a lesser degree by insecurity, but it is deliberate by the Ethiopian and Eritrean forces. And we have, the worst starvation crime for a generation unfolding in front of our eyes. We cannot pretend it is anything else.
Thank you. That's very chilling, and appreciate your sharing that and your expertise on it. Welcome other comments on the humanitarian dimension.
Thank you. So just first of all, I want to say that, the nature of the conflict is starting to shift a little bit. And in recent weeks, we're especially concerned about increasing combat between parties to the conflict which is curtailing already limited humanitarian assistance. And in recent months, we're also seeing increased attacks on humanitarian aid workers, which is really concerning. So whereas at the beginning of the conflict, it was sort of larger scale killings, massacres, looting, destruction, we're now seeing a slightly different shift where there's just greater attacks on humanitarian assistance and impediments to delivering it. And now we're getting into a lot of signs of, hunger and also like just massive and horrific sexual and gender-based violence. So in response to that, the US has invested a significant amount more recently for humanitarian assistance, specifically to assisting refugees and internally displaced persons, to increase emergency food assistance, safe drinking water, sanitation, shelter protection. And on March 1st, USAID deployed a disaster assistance response team to scale up their humanitarian assistance operations in Tigray in response to all of these terrible reports that are coming out.
Thank you. Now, since I've started the advocacy I've been doing around the Tigray situation, I've heard from a lot of different diaspora communities and others saying this issue is important, and there are other things going on in other parts of Ethiopia as well. Significant human rights concerns raised about dynamics in Amhara, in Oromia, and elsewhere. What are the what is the situation throughout the country as it compares to Tigray, and what are the implications of what's happening in Tigray for other parts of the country?
Right,
Let me just take the first crack.
Sorry, go ahead, Michelle, but I think you're back on mute.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought Emily wanted to respond, but I'll be brief.
Yeah.
Just to say that yes, there's civil conflict happening in pockets all over Ethiopia. Several organizations have mapped it, and we look at a map of Ethiopia, and if the conflict is, a red dot, it looks like Ethiopia's got a bad case of the measles. You've got very significant conflict in Benishangul Gumuz and other parts of the country where essentially some of these are deeply rooted. Some of it is about communities who feel extremely threatened by the idea of pivoting away from ethnic federalism and a sort of rights and access that they have enjoyed under a certain system. There's some opportunism right now as Tigray is devastated, and you've seen Amhara militia move in and essentially claim land that prior to this conflict had been considered Tigray for Amhara. So there's kind of an unraveling, right, of what the rules of the road had been before in terms of contestation, particularly for land around the country and for political rights and access. But it's not just in Ethiopia, right? It's spilling over to a very worrisome border conflict with Sudan that could easily escalate into interstate war, and also has really serious repercussions for Sudan's own transition. You have this kind of disintegration of basic norms with, Eritrean troops in Ethiopia committing these crimes, the prime minister telling the international community they're going to leave, but they are not, a sort of sense that kind of some of the most basic rules of the international system don't seem to apply anymore. It's also affecting Somalia and their political development, where Eritrea also is playing an important role. So there is, from a kind of geopolitical point of view, an incredibly worrying sense of metastasizing conflict and erosion of basic international norms that puts an even wider swath of civilians at risk.
If I may, I think that's absolutely correct, and I think there's two dimensions to this that we need also to pay attention to, in particular. One is the dismantling of key institutions of the Ethiopian state. Now, those institutions were not very respectful of human rights, but they did function, and the National Army actually, on some respects, had a good reputation. It served in many peacekeeping missions, and on an issue of something like sexual and gender-based violence, the Ethiopians, compared to just about every other contingent, where he served in Somalia and Sudan, etc., had a good reputation. Now, what we know from the research that's been done into sexual violence in conflict is, yes, there's a certain amount of it that happens because, quotes, boys will be boys, a rather distasteful and disgusting rationale. But when you see gang rape, organized rape by that, it is not that. That does not happen spontaneously. It happens because there is an instruction by a commander, invariably. And so we need to start looking into the command structure of the Ethiopian military as it is now. Look at those top generals. What are the orders they are giving, explicitly or implicitly? Because those orders and that institutional functioning is not just going to affect Tigray. The rest of the country is going to be affected too. And one of the sort of the simplistic errors of analysis that many Ethiopians, I think, subscribed to when the war began was, we can punish the Tigrayans and this will bring the rest of us together. Not so. If you pursue this type of ethnic profiling, targeting, and frankly, hatred, and your key institutions like the army are actually processing orders to commit crimes of this nature, and sexual crimes are the key case. Do not expect it to stay there. Others will be affected too. The other point that perhaps we could come back to later is that the international community, the United Nations, the African Union, has invested an enormous amount in conflict management, early warning, response, peacekeeping, diplomacy, etc., in the Horn of Africa, more than probably any other part of the world. Enormous peacekeeping missions, enormous investment in mediation, etc. None of that has happened. None of that has been operationalized. The African Union has, as somebody who spent a lot of time and energy invested in trying to make the African Union work, I say I report dismally, it has failed. It did not work. The Sudanese Prime Minister, Abdallah Hamdok, tried to make the Northeast African Regional Organization, IGAD, Intergovernmental Authority on Development work. It didn't. It wasn't possible. And the United Nations, and I have to say, perhaps this is where Canada could use its leverage. The UN Secretary General has not stepped up to the plate on this. This is a part of the world in which there is more sort of multilateral equity, and this is a specialism of Canada over the decades. There's more multilateral equity invested in the Horn of Africa than anywhere else I can think of. And that equity has not been drawn upon. It has not been utilized. We've seen the emergency relief coordinator, the head of UN OCHA, making very, very strong reports to the UN Security Council. We would have hoped to see the Secretary General say, yes, we need a system-wide United Nations response, instead of which the response has been extremely weak. So I just want to make those 2 points. And Canada actually has some purchase on both, because Canada has been involved in advising the Ethiopian security sector. So I think Canada could send strong messages to those senior commanders that have no illusions. The trail of accountability, when we begin to pursue it, could lead to you. So be warned. And then the issue of the UN.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Emily. Yeah.
Okay. So I just want to say that I think this also comes back to the initial framing question in the context around the conflict in Tigray, right? Like, we can't look at what's happening in Tigray in a vacuum, right? It's ultimately a political conflict. And at the same time, we're seeing increased inter-ethnic and intercommunal violence throughout Ethiopia. And all of these tensions are a symptom of broader challenges related to political representation and inclusive governance. And the Ethiopian government really needs to redouble its efforts to find political solutions to address this violence and conflicts elsewhere, especially in advance of the upcoming elections in June. And they need to be working more now to engage, not just the ruling party, but with, opposition parties, with civil society, and with other key stakeholders to come up with more inclusive governance and dialogue. But that's really I just think, to that original question about, how does Tigray relate to all these other hotspots that are experiencing conflict, and they are related, right? It's ultimately part of a political and governance problem.
Thank you so much for all of your comments so far. We're now, I've got many more questions I could ask, but I think now's a good time to transition to asking some of the great questions that have come from the audience. Judith, do you want to kick us off with an audience question?
Absolutely. So thank you, Garnett, and thank you to all of you for the highly informative and compelling remarks and just informative discussion. This has been very helpful to us and to the audience. We've had a number of questions coming in, and I'll start with the first one, which speaks more to the international legal context of the atrocities, and it reads as follows. What are the possible legal implications and possible recourse of the victims to hold the perpetrators accountable and get some rights preserved? In reference to the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice.
So we've talked a bit about the cessation of violence and then the kind of accountability piece. And we've talked repeatedly about the requirements and the necessity for access in order to do documentation, in order to preserve evidence, in order to be able to have that. Any sort of that, personal accountability, criminal accountability, future holding of individuals responsible, it absolutely demands that we have the evidence to a standard sufficient to seek out actual individual accountability. And so it's why we continue to bring that up, and it continues to be a focus, and it continues to be an area of effort, because if you do not have the sufficient information in sufficient detail with enough specificity that you can actually point to individuals that are responsible, it's really, really difficult to achieve that level of accountability and to get and seek the justice that the victims obviously demand and are deserve. And so it's a reason why we continue to kind of press that point and believe that the access, the unfettered access, the honest access, the ability for individuals to do real investigation, real documentation, real collection, not tainted, is so crucial in any sort of transitional justice framework and long-range transitional justice plan.
If I could just add on that, of course, prosecution before a court is, as it were, the gold standard of accountability. But let's not lose sight of the other measures drawn from the toolkit of transitional justice that need not wait for this these sorts of processes of prosecution, which will be likely to be selective and delayed. Starting with recognizing the crime, starting with acknowledging that these crimes, and I will repeat again, if we could come away from this with one thing, it would be to have just to send a message to women and girls of Tigray: we believe you, and to acknowledge the dignity of those who are suffering these abominable crimes, but also then to acknowledge starvation crimes, because those who go through and emerge from famine, it is a deeply humiliating and traumatizing experience. It's a deep sense of failure for parents to not be able to feed their children, to people who are accustomed to being part of a community, to turn away your neighbor who is starving because you have enough food, but only for today, and you have your own children. And these micro cruelties and humiliations are things that live with people after the famine is over. And it's one reason why it takes often generations for famine to be acknowledged for what it is. Think of Ireland. It was 150 years before the Irish were able to begin to come to terms with what they had suffered in the 1840s. And in that context, to be able to say, this is a starvation crime, to tell those communities, those parents who are failing their children, it is not your fault. This is being done to you, I think is very important. And then we can look at other issues, telling the truth and reconciliation, but also reparation and compensation. So those who have been stripped of their livelihoods, those whose everything they saved over decades has been destroyed or stolen, those whose fruit trees have been chopped down, and also to think about this perhaps at a higher level too. The international donors put a whole lot of money into Tigray, and they put the money in because this was a very poor part of the world, very food insecure, these farmers struggling to grow crops on these stony soils in order to lift people out of poverty so that we wouldn't need to feed them again. And it was very successful. It really worked, very sophisticated systems. I'm a UK citizen. The UK government paid for, through UNICEF and through Department for International Development, the water supply systems of about half a dozen major towns in Tigray. My money as a taxpayer went into water systems that have been trashed, that have been destroyed, looted, vandalized. And I'm sure Canada and the United States and all of us, from our church groups, from our contributions to Save the Children Fund, to our bilateral assistance through our governments, has gone into resources in Tigray that have been destroyed by the Ethiopian federal authorities and by the Eritreans. And should we not be calling those governments to account for what they have done to what we provided? I certainly don't, if I'm continuing to pay taxes, I do not want my tax money to go to a government that will not even recognize that it has taken my money and destroyed it. Sorry, I'm beginning to lose my argument. I feel passionately that we are missing out on a key point of ethics and of leverage on this.
Can I just respond really quickly to Alex on one specific point about, as he spoke about, that accountability is one part of the kind of broader sort of sense of transitional justice, and that at least inside of the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, when we are talking about atrocity prevention downstream, specifically as it relates to transitional justice, there is absolutely an understanding that it cannot just be retributive, that there has to be the restorative aspect, and that there is the full spectrum of what that looks like, and that be it memorialization, be it truth and reconciliation, that all of those must be addressed, and that simply holding individuals accountable is not the only sort of answer to that, and that we absolutely agree that there are many different ways in which justice is actually served, and victims, and it has to be victims focused, and so you have to understand intrinsically what is required by the victims, which means you have to have people on the ground, you have to be having those conversations, you have to have a decent enough understanding and be willing to realize that what is required, what is desired, what is going to actually lead to healing and stopping the continual cycle of atrocities and violence is actually what the victims need. And so I very much agree with your assessment, and a lot of those options are great as far as looking at how to do that. But criminal accountability is important, but it is not the only piece in the justice puzzle.
Thank you, Jeff and Alex. Garnett, if I may, we've received another question from the audience specifically for Alex de Waal, and it reads as follows. Thank you, Alex de Waal, for bringing these statistics that warn massive starvation might occur in Tigray. Why is the United States and other member states not taking decisive actions to combat this humanitarian crisis in the Tigray region? And when do you think is the right time for the UN Security Council to intervene with its peacekeeping mission after millions die of hunger?
I think the question answers itself, really. The time for the UN Security Council to take action was several months ago. It was Ireland that brought the case of Tigray to the UN Security Council under Resolution 2417. Now, for those of you not familiar with it, Resolution 2417 is entitled Armed Conflict and Hunger. It was adopted almost exactly 3 years ago, unanimously. Ethiopia was on the Security Council. Abiy Ahmed had just become Prime Minister, and it voted in favor of it. Among other things, this resolution says that use of starvation as a weapon of war may be a war crime. And it calls for the UN Secretary General to bring a case of impending famine or armed conflict leading to widespread food insecurity swiftly to the attention of the council. It doesn't specify what should be done. It mentions sanctions as an option, but doesn't go any further. Now, the Ireland and the United States and some European countries have pushed this. They faced a threat of a veto from Russia and China. Now, under other circumstances, the Russians and Chinese might not have threatened a veto. The rationale for veto is that it's internal affairs of a member state. And frankly, it's not internal because we know Eritrea is involved, but there's been no official acknowledgement of that. So they can still, the pretense can be maintained that it is internal. But the key factor here is the African countries. If the African countries were to support robust action, then Russia and China they might abstain, but they would not veto in any resolution. And I have to say, I think the African Union, the leadership of African countries, and even African civil society has really failed to respond to this, has not spoken out strongly, has not put pressure on governments. I know there's a deep dismay among Africans about what is happening, but they have not articulated a coherent response. And the particular tragedy of this is that some 20, 25 years ago, in response to the genocide in Rwanda, the war in Congo, the coup in Sierra Leone, all sorts of abuses, the African Union, the Organization of African Unity said, we cannot continue as we are now. This was the 1990s. We cannot allow governments to abuse their own people behind the shield of sovereignty. And so they adopted norms and principles and institutions whereby Africans would respond, would be the first responders to these sorts of crises. The norm of non-indifference, which is the precursor to the responsibility to protect. The idea that if grave circumstances, like war crimes occur, you need to respond, etc., etc. And the African Union is not a strong organization, but those norms and principles worked well when they are applied. And it has failed to do that. And if the African Union fails to do that, and it comes to the UN Security Council, the Africans cannot, in all good conscience, then say, this is external interference, because it is actually their own norms and principles being invoked at a higher level. So I don't think we should have any hesitation about saying that, if Africa and the African institutions are not able to respond to this, the UN should do so. It just requires a greater political commitment. And the last thing I would say on this is those who are involved in advocacy on this, please also call on your African networks to speak out about this. We want to hear more demands made of African leaders and policymakers, more opinion columns in African newspapers and so on.
Can I just real quick jump in and say that one encouraging thing that I see is the deployment of the new U.S. Special Envoy for the Horn, Jeff Feltman, who's gone out to the region. He is an extraordinarily capable diplomat with UN and U.S. experience. And I do see this as a really positive sign of the U.S. Being able to, it's difficult at the start of any administration. You don't always have people in the seats, and it takes a while to get through confirmation processes, et cetera. But here is a senior diplomat who's ready to go out there and try and help assess and build the kind of political consensus needed to end conflict and get to solutions, and to send a more unified message to authorities in Addis and Asmara and elsewhere about what the world will and will not accept. So I would say that, in a sea of very bad news, I see this as a genuinely encouraging step because, as Emily rightly pointed out, ultimately the issues are political. And so having a little more diplomatic heft out on the ground to work these issues is a positive sign.
And could I just come in with one final point? I completely agree with it's been very impressive, the position taken by the Biden administration. And of course, they face this enormous constraint that it just takes so long to get people in place. One thing that they did, which I thought was very important, was on Monday, the US ambassador invited the patriarch of the Orthodox Church to lunch. And the significance of this is that last week, the patriarch, a video of the patriarch had been taken a few weeks before, was made public, in which he spoke candidly, and he said that the situation in Tigray is totally unacceptable. He described it as genocide. He came under an enormous amount of pressure, political pressure, including politically motivated pushback from within the Church Synod. And I thought it was absolutely the right thing to do, that immediately after that, the US ambassador should not only invite him for lunch, but make that a very public affirmation that the US stands with his right to make such a statement, and implicitly saying, don't touch this man.
That's a good segue into the question I was going to ask, but it's now mostly been answered. We had Simon Hills asking specifically about Patriarch Matthias speaking out about the situation and wondering the implications for him, and you've answered that to some extent, but also wondering whether there are voices like him, prominent religious or other civil society voices inside Ethiopia who are engaging in this conversation in a constructive way, and what the role could be for those kinds of civil society leaders, faith leaders, to bridge some of the divides. I also saw another question. I can't find it, but I want to refer to it as well because I think it's important. Is I think a comparison had been made earlier to the situation in Yugoslavia, and I'd be curious if, to what extent the situation is similar or different, and just in terms of how it's developing, and what the international community has learned or failed to learn from that past experience. So on either of those points, if anybody wants to pick up.
Look, I could just say quickly that certainly there are incredibly courageous Ethiopian voices speaking out, but there are a lot of, it's not that they lack courage, there are a lot of Ethiopians who feel very constrained about what they can say publicly. There's a tremendous amount of fear in Ethiopia right now. And I think a number of people who are positioned such that they may be able to have some influence with authorities in Addis, and are careful and discreet so as not to lose their, it's not that they want proximity to power, it's they're hoping to solve the problem. So I have found, as someone who sits in think tank land in the United States, it's quite difficult to get Ethiopian guests sometimes, at a round table, et cetera, because there's a lot of concern about what you say, or even what somebody else says, and you're at the same meeting. So it's a challenging situation. So the point I want to make is, yes, there are courageous Ethiopian voices, and they deserve to be listened to. And it's an incredibly important part of finding the way out of this political, security, and humanitarian crisis. But it is also not reasonable to expect Ethiopians to be kind of leading the charge because it's simply not safe for the vast majority of them to do so. I'm going to leave Yugoslavia to others.
Okay, let me make 2 points about Yugoslavia. One is that we, for some, after Prime Minister Abiy took power, we've been talking about the reform agenda. Frankly, I don't think we should talk about the reform agenda any longer. There is no credible reform agenda. We should be talking about a state building or stopping a state falling apart agenda, because any prospect for democratic reform, for liberalization, for human rights is fundamentally premised on having a functioning state of some sort. And that actually is the immediate and overriding consideration. And my fear about the electoral process that's unfolding or quasi-unfolding, because the level of preparedness is very, very low, is that it will be a further polarization and actually another step on the road towards what one might call state disassembly. On the Yugoslav element, there is the Yugoslav parallel. There's something that I think we need to be alert to, and for some months now, the Tigrayan community, especially in the diaspora, who are the ones obviously with whom we have the greatest contact, have been pressing for an agenda of independence. Now, according to the 1994 Constitution of Ethiopia, which is a very controversial document, there is a right of self-determination up to and including independence. Now, according to that constitution, that can only be pursued with a very complex procedural process, which would not be possible if the federal government is opposed to it. So in effect, it is inoperable precisely in the circumstances in which one of the federal state, the states of the federation, might want to opt for independence, such as Tigray at the moment. Now, the prospect of Tigray achieving independence is, of course, under current international circumstances, vanishingly remote. But one understands also that the sentiment of many Tigrayans of we don't want anything to do with Ethiopia because not only of the gravity of abuses inflicted upon us, but also because of the rhetoric that comes from the highest level to say that we are not Ethiopians, and there's there's a lot of terrible hate speech, and remarks made by senior officials to say that now we have got rid of the Tigrayans from the National Army or whatever other institution, we can be fully Ethiopian, which sends a message to the Tigrayans: you're not Ethiopians. So we are faced with a real prospect that we have an insurgency in Tigray, which is quite a capable insurgency, in which the agenda is going to be independence, which is unlikely in practical terms in any foreseeable circumstances to be sustainable or achievable. So while the international sort of diplomatic community is trying to figure out how we engage with Prime Minister Abiy and the federal government, and also with the government in Asmara, there's been no engagement at all with the Tigrayan leadership. Now, many of us, including myself, are deeply critical of that TPLF leadership because it was highly culpable in the outbreak of the war. But the reality is that once the war is broken out, it has to be recognized as a belligerent party, and there has to be some dealings with it. And there are no dealings with it. We can't even place a phone call to it. It's astonishing. In the year 2021, you know who are the senior figures there, but you cannot call them up because you have to rely on them getting access to a satellite phone and very occasionally to where there's cell phone coverage and calling out. And unless we are able to have some sort of dialogue as an international community, as diplomats, with that leadership, they are going to, first of all, be developing agendas without any dialogue with the rest of the world. And if a package is negotiated by the special envoy, Jeff Feltman, to the effect that this is what we would like to do, what happens if the Tigrayans say no? We're not interested. You don't have any credibility with us because you were not there when we needed you. That is a very crucial gap that needs to be filled.
Not specifically about Yugoslavia, but the meeting I had that immediately preceded this event was specifically a lessons learned meeting. And it was with folks that had been desk officers and policy officers in multiple atrocity and conflict situations, that we were looking at a couple different things that are happening globally currently to see what we can learn from. Because absolutely, there is an understanding of trying not to repeat the mistakes previously, trying not to relearn lessons, and that the hope is that through having obviously sat through a few different issues and conflicts and atrocity scenarios in multiple regions and multiple countries, can we actually apply those lessons going forward with the understanding that there is always difference and that you don't want to simply, we have the perfect toolkit, we're going to roll it out and it's going to fit into every scenario, because it doesn't. And so absolutely ensuring that you have enough of the information locally so that you can sort of move forward through that intelligently. And so to answer the question, absolutely we are looking at what we have done previously in the idea of how do we be smarter when we do it this time.
Go ahead, Judith. Did you want to ask the next one?
Yes, thank you to both of you. There's another question that has come in, a little bit different this time. In addition to the devastating Tigray conflict, there are other crises in Ethiopia that call for a holistic approach and look at the multiple crises in Ethiopia. There is ethnic cleansing of Amharas from Oromia and Benishangul Gumez. There are also multiple reports of extrajudicial killings of Oromos in Oromia and repression in many parts of Ethiopia. What should the international actors do to help Ethiopia get back to normalcy, in addition to resolving the Tigray conflict and the devastating humanitarian crisis?
Well, I think that, one issue which has been alluded to is really the need for some inclusive political dialogue. And, there's a long history of national dialogues, some that have worked and some that are abject failures. But one thing that I think is very important right now is for the international community to make clear that these elections, should they be held, in fact, in early June, as they're scheduled to be, these are not, given the conditions in Ethiopia right now, the areas of the country that are essentially under martial law, right? Tigrayans aren't going to be voting at all. This churn and conflict and crisis, in addition to kind of fundamental problems with voter registration, you've got parties boycotting the process. These elections are not going to be a clear signpost of the will of the Ethiopian people. And I do think that there's a degree to which the government in Addis thinks that these, at least from the point of view of external actors, will be a real legitimizing exercise. These elections haven't been held yet, but the pre-election conditions are such that they're not going to be free, fair, and credible. And so the important thing for the international community is to signal this exercise is insufficient, right, to address these fundamental political crises, and to try to help to the degree that we can provide some scaffolding around a process of dialogue that's going to have to be as inclusive as possible. And of course, Alex raises the really important fundamental point that once you've delegitimized important actors, determined that they're criminal and can't come to the table, you're going to have gaping holes in any kind of consensus or plan going forward. But these are, there are instances elsewhere where there have been parallel processes, quiet processes that have eventually allowed for a more inclusive approach. And I just don't see, for all the questions and flaws with national dialogue processes, I don't see any other way forward to get some rules of the road that the vast majority of Ethiopians can agree on to go forward. Because otherwise, right, contestation, whatever your frustration or disagreement with the state or your neighbors or local authorities or federal authorities, if there's no rules of the road, what you get is just more and more conflict.
I wanted to ask a question about sanctions. Fevin had asked, can Ethiopia be sanctioned? We have the Magnitsky sanctions tool in Canada for targeting those involved in gross violations of human rights. I know that you have it in the United States. Your government has been more willing to use that tool, quite frankly, than our government has been, but both have those options in front of them. Are there lists being put together? Are there individuals who should be sanctioned, either on the Ethiopian or Eritrean side? And is that an effective way of responding to the current challenges in front of us?
I can't answer the question about what actually is being done in terms of individuals. But I think I think sanctions have come a long way. I mean, we tend to, when we speak about sanctions, we tend to think about, the overall, blanket sanctions that were imposed on, Iraq under Saddam Hussein, et cetera, et cetera. And clearly, to put those sanctions of that type on a country like Ethiopia would be wrong and potentially disastrous, because, it is we cannot afford for Ethiopia to go into that level of poverty and desperation that would follow. But two key points to bear in mind. One is that the sanctions that were imposed on Eritrea for some years were very effective. And they really constrained the Eritrean government for many years from destabilizing the region. And one of the unfortunate consequences of the sort of critical acclaim of the Ethio-Eritrean peace deal which was a very secret deal of the deal of 3 years ago, was that it allowed Eritrea to escape from those sanctions and rearm and so on. And it's the principal partner in that the Eritreans had was the Emiratis, who were using the port city of Asaba as a base for their operations in Yemen. Now, the Emiratis decided that it wasn't worth the reputational risk a few months ago, and they packed up and left, and that's good. And I think putting tight sanctions back on Eritrea would be quite effective. I think we should go further and look at those sorts of targeted sanctions aimed at individuals and institutions, because one of the things that Eritrea would do is, in much the same way that Iran has used Iraq to try and work around sanctions, they would take control of Ethiopian companies, Ethiopian institutions as a workaround. They would maybe finance their army by through the Ethiopian route. The Ethiopians would go buy weapons and provide them, etc. These are the sorts of stratagems. But I'm sure that those of you in the US government, you have your colleagues who are perfectly capable of tracking these sorts of things and putting your thumb on the key place to stop it, stop these things from happening, probably without telling anyone, least of all someone like me, what you're up to. But I think the targeted sanctions can work both by those very quiet ways of choking off things, like illicit arms supplies, but also by sending messages, so that making it clear that we understand that sexual and gender-based violence on this scale has to originate in the army command. This isn't men out of control. This is men under control, and therefore we are going to, put our finger on these individuals in the high command, and we are going to hold you accountable by putting sanctions on you until this stops. I think that would be perfectly reasonable course of action. It may be a little bit of a stretch to interpret the rules and regulations in that regard, but I think it's something we should call for.
I don't want to put anyone too much on the spot here. I know that you don't want to scoop politicians who might have announcements coming or not, but do any of our representatives from the US government want to weigh in at all on the question of sanctions, or what may be being discussed? No pressure at all if that's overstepping, but
So I think it will go to no surprise that we really can't talk about.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
Can't talk about this. I can say that we are exploring any possible ways to apply pressure, whether it's public messaging or whatever. It can speak to sanctions in a very general sense, because we have used them in other countries, and they are a very complicated process that requires a lot of information, and they can take a long time to put together. And but we are considering all. We are open to considering all possible avenues to apply pressure.
Targeted sanctions, election monitoring, working with civil society and NGOs, strengthening government institutions, targeted sanctions, diplomacy. These are all things that are in our toolbox that we constantly look at, and absolutely believe that we have to kind of apply them all. So as Emily correctly stated, we look at everything that we have available.
Let me just thank you for that, and I'll just comment from a Canadian perspective that I would like to see, and I think many parliamentarians from all sides would like to see our government use these tools as part of the full range of tools, and working collaboratively with our allies. We know that when there are targeted sanctions against individual human rights abusers, they are most effective when they are done in coordination among like-minded partners, and I hope that our government will be constructively involved in those discussions, and I will be continuing to push on that. Judith, over to you for
So Garnett, it's an interesting remark, because we have a question that came in from one of our Canadian participants, and the question is pretty much, you've answered half of it, but let me put it to you this way and see what you can do in terms of one of our Canadian member of parliament, see what you can answer on the second part. So the first part was, what are some concrete steps that Canada can take to address the atrocities? So I think you addressed sanctions as one of the steps, and then what has Canada done to date?
Well, I mean, full disclosure, I am a member of the opposition. So, but I certainly try to work constructively and have. When it comes to these human rights issues, sometimes it's helpful to have the external pressure and the internal pressure. We have members of the government caucus asking the government to do more, and members of the opposition asking the government to do more in a different way and from a different angle. So. There has been a lot of activity in Parliament around this, members raising this issue, many petitions tabled by different members. The government has tabled responses to those petitions. I just read one of the latest responses this morning, tabled a couple days ago, identifying the fact that they have been raising these issues with senior officials in Ethiopia, as well as raising these issues in multilateral fora. That's a great first step. We would like to see Canada do more, express clear support for investigation processes that are underway and additional investigation processes that are needed. I as well would like to see Canada be prepared to use the Magnitsky sanctions tool in identifying those involved in gross violations of human rights and targeting that. As I mentioned, since the passage of Canada's Magnitsky law, we have been very limited in our use of it. And in some cases, we've chosen other sanctions tools. We've chosen the Special Economic Measures Act as opposed to the Magnitsky Act. But the Magnitsky Act is supposed to be tailor-made to deal specifically with human rights abuses. And I think as well, we need to explore ways in which there can be a parliamentary trigger for governments to at least investigate or report on the application of Magnitsky sanctions in certain cases. My understanding is that the U.S. Magnitsky Act has some kind of a legislative trigger where members of the legislature can push things forward and at least require a government response on them. So I think Canada can do more to lead on human rights in general, and especially in this case. And viewers, listeners can expect parliamentarians to continue to be active on that, and we hope to see further steps from the government.
Thank you, Garnett. And I think we're starting to run almost out of time. I think we might close with one last question, and I think all of you can probably answer this. Jeffrey Feltman has described Tigray as a concentration camp, and a heartfelt thanks to you, Alex de Waal, in particular, for so eloquently framing the urgency. If African countries do not stand up and the matter continues to be voted in the UN Security Council and the UN Secretary General continues to have a weak stand, what are other things that can be done to intervene?
Let me make just one suggestion, which is to do with humanitarian access. Back in the 1980s, when there was famine in Tigray and the then government of Ethiopia refused humanitarian access, there was cross-border access from Sudan, supported by, run by NGOs, supported by the US government, in defiance of the Ethiopian government. In my engagement over the last several months, I have not been advocating that. In fact, I've been telling the Tigrayans that they should look to negotiated access from, across the front lines around from Mekelle and so on. But the Ethiopian government has made it very clear that is not an option. So I think we go back to that type of cross-border access from Sudan, and I think the US government should and other governments should come in behind that and should set up and ensure a channel to the areas of Tigray held by the Tigray Defense Forces, regardless of what the Ethiopian government has to say about it.
With regards to challenges of raising Ethiopia and Tigray in the Security Council, you know, there are many different committees within the United Nations, and the United States is looking for opportunities across the board to raise Tigray, whether it's thematic sessions on food insecurity or protecting civilians or women and girls. We are looking and, you know, for any opportunity to elevate this process. You know, I think additionally, it's just so important that the entire international community is working together and speaking with one voice to find a resolution and to ensure that there is an immediate cessation of hostilities. Like, it's just unbelievable that at this point in the conflict, parties to the conflict are not agreeing to that. And, you know, also to apply pressure on the Eritrean troops to leave, and for Prime Minister Abiy to follow through on his commitments to seeing them out. Finally, I think, you know, back to some things that Alex said earlier, it would be great to see the African Union take a stronger stance, and African countries engage more, not just at the African Union level, but directly with the governments involved and all parties to the conflict.
Did our final two guests want to weigh in response to that question, or offer some other concluding remarks about our next steps here?
Well, I would just say, I think that, you know, as desirable as consensus at the Security Council might be, and as much as I don't think it makes sense to write that off, and I do think that U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield's been doing an amazing job continuing to try and raise and elevate this issue despite the pushback from others. One reason I'm particularly encouraged by Jeff Feltman's appointment and deployment to the field is that you can start to build you know, consensus where it's available, and that means certainly more African voices, but also Gulf actors who have a complicated set of interests and engagements in the Horn, for them to feel pressure to be constructive in this arena as well. So I don't think one waits for the perfect, right? You start to build the coalition as best you can to ensure that actors both in Addis and in Asmara feel the pressure and recognize that their strategic vision will be unachievable should there continue to be, you know, this level of conflict and these kinds of atrocities. So I think that, you know, I tend to put a lot of weight in the diplomatic strategy, because I think it's the only one likely to succeed. And sometimes it's not very loud, but ultimately I think it will be the most effective.
And I would just say that Emily incredibly eloquently and accurately stated where we're sort of looking from a department and building perspective. And so I will let her statements stand as they are.
Well, thank you very much. And we'll wrap up now in the interests of ending on time. Merci encore à vous tous. Cette discussion a été importante, puissante, et de fond. This has been an important and very substantial conversation looking at the human rights issues, the humanitarian issues, the wider political context, the role of domestic actors as well as regional and international actors. Judith, it's been a pleasure co-moderating with you, and I want to thank the Raoul Wallenberg Centre again for all the just incredible work they do on so many different human rights issues around the world. You're a powerful resource for us as parliamentarians. We often have opinions on things, but we don't have the time or the resources to do the research or get the detail in the same way that you and other civil society organizations do, and are able to supply us with the support. And I want to just encourage all of those who are following this discussion to think about the steps that you can take to support the action that is required. Engage your elected officials, especially at the national level, and in conversations about these issues, and encourage them to take them up in a substantial way, and also think about the steps you can take to increase awareness. There was one question that came in about whether this was recorded and available. This conversation is streaming on YouTube, and I'd encourage you to take the link from that conversation, share it on your own personal social media channels, help us to raise greater awareness and create a strong momentum. I know these are challenging times for us here in Canada in the midst of another wave of COVID-19. We have seen during the COVID pandemic how there has been an escalation in many parts of the world of human rights abuses. In some cases, following the sad expectation that those of us who normally follow these issues will be paying less attention to human rights abuses around the world because we're distracted by domestic considerations. So it's all the more important for all of us to reject that, to say, notwithstanding the challenges, the very significant challenges we're facing here, that we will refuse to be distracted. We will refuse to ignore abuses of human rights that are taking place in other parts of the world at the same time. We won't allow bad actors to take advantage of the current circumstances to further victimize people who are already vulnerable as a result of those same circumstances. And your presence here, your participation, listening to this important conversation is a first step in showing your interest and your commitment in responding to these issues. So thank you so much for that. I see the YouTube link has been shared in the chat, so please do take that opportunity to share this conversation. And stay tuned for further steps on this issue from us in Parliament and from the Raoul Wallenberg Centre.
Thank you very much.